Hello and welcome to The Sidebar, presented by True Crime News, taking you inside the courtrooms of high-profile and notorious cases from across the country. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer based in Los Angeles and previously an LA County prosecutor for over a decade. We are recording this on Wednesday, July 15th, 2026. In this week's episode, the approaching trial of Lindseay Clancy, the Massachusetts mother who faces murder charges for the deaths of her 3 children. Plus, the New Jersey husband of a murder victim lawyers up as the investigation into the fatal stabbing of his wife continues. But first, an Idaho mother is charged with the murders of her twins after claiming that vaccines claimed the twin toddlers' lives. Today, we are joined by Sam Bassett, a criminal defense attorney and legal analyst you can catch on Court TV and many other outlets. Sam, welcome. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm good. Getting a little rain here in Austin, but otherwise doing great.
Glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear, and I'm also looking forward to your thoughts because you are a practicing criminal defense attorney. And some of these cases, though we're not going to really get into the weeds of them, I think they do need a unique practitioner's mind to kind of help us unwind some of the issues at play here. So let's first jump in out of Payette, Idaho. A mother who claimed her twin toddlers died from vaccines has been charged with killing them. Andrea Shaw faces 2 counts of murder in the deaths of her 18-month-old twins, Dallas and Tyson, after an investigation concluded that the mother suffocated them. Shaw, however, denies the allegations and has leaned heavily into the anti-vaccination movement, even appearing on a podcast produced by the Children's Health Defense, an anti-vax group that with ties to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Shaw and her husband called authorities after finding Dallas and Tyson lying in their bed face down with both children cold to the touch. According to Shaw, authorities immediately focused in on the mother and her husband, despite the couple previously warning doctors about the twins' adverse reactions to routine hepatitis A, DTaP, and flu vaccines. Police arrested Shaw more than a year after the twins' death, about 5 days after the mother gave birth to another child. Shaw's defense sought to lower her $2 million bond to $100,000 in order to reunite the mother with her newborn, but a judge revoked her bond entirely, finding that Shaw posed a risk to her infant, even if she wasn't a risk to the community at large. Shaw is also engaged in a lawsuit filed by the Children's Health Defense against the American Academy of Pediatrics, accusing the medical organization of racketeering. While multiple autopsies have reportedly been performed on the twins in the wake of their deaths, authorities have not released that information thus far. First thing on this, Sam, I want to jump into is the bail. I thought this was kind of interesting. She was originally had a $2 million bail. They were asking to reduce it for, I think, a very good reason. She just had a baby. She's got a 5-month-old at home, apparently, who is still breastfeeding. And she's saying, listen, and apparently I think this child was born prematurely or there's some sort of risk for the child. And she's saying, listen, I need to be out to take care of this baby. And the judge says, not only am I not going to reduce it, I'm revoking your bond entirely because of the new baby. I feel that you pose a risk to this new baby, not the community at large, but to this baby. I don't want to influence your answer on this too much, but what are your thoughts? Go ahead and jump in.
Well, I think that this judge must have some information, probable cause information from the underlying case to be convinced that she had something to do with the deaths of these deceased children. And so if that's the case, why would the judge take a risk of putting her with a very, very young baby on conditions of bond without supervision? So I think you could argue, I guess the baby can come to the prison or the jail and be breastfed there. But what would happen to the judge if the other baby died too? I think that's got to be his thinking on not just reducing the bond, but revoking it. So I think obviously the safety to the community is always a criteria, and that baby is part of the community.
Yeah, I mean, I totally understand that. I mean, the last thing the judge would hate to have happen on his watch is for that new baby to die under suspicious circumstances, and he think to himself, there's something he could have done. But aren't judges trying to look for less restrictive means? Like, it seems to me he could have said that she couldn't be with the baby unsupervised, or I'm trying to think of another example where you've got a woman with no criminal record. Yes, she's been charged with something awful, but he's going to go ahead and revoke bail entirely just to protect the safety of one person. Am I reading too much into this, or you think the judge made the right call?
I think he probably made the right call, but he must have known more about the situation than the basic facts of the case to come to this conclusion that there was a huge risk. Obviously, this vaccine defense, so to speak, indicates she's really deflecting from what could be the scientific evidence in the case showing that the vaccines had nothing to do with it. So the judge must have come to some preliminary conclusions himself as to her guilt or innocence.
Yeah, let's get into that defense, because it is the thing that really has put this on the radar of a lot of folks. So initially she says, or blames herself, vaccines. She's saying that both the twins died soon after receiving their initial round of vaccines. I got to tell you, I'm a father of 3 little ones myself. I remember going through these vaccines. Nowadays, we have a lot of distrust towards these vaccines. And it was something that my wife and I thought seriously about, like, God, how many of these things do they really need? Do we need to give them all of them? We decided, follow the medical advice and current science. And, last thing we want is to put them at risk. But this is obviously, I'm saying, something that a lot of parents who may be potential jurors are thinking about. And they're saying that's what caused it. Now, obviously, investigators, medical examiners see this otherwise. To me, the question becomes, why did it take so long, do you think? If this is a matter of an autopsy, you would think an autopsy could quickly evaluate whether it was a vaccine or, now they're saying strangulation that caused these deaths. Is there maybe room for a defense in how long it took them to arrive at this decision?
Well, the other thing that occurs to me about the length of time is she must have been pregnant, and they probably wanted to wait for her to have the baby, the new baby, before they sprung the arrest warrant on her. That's one thing that comes to mind.
Interesting.
I mean, the science is the science. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of overlap between deaths caused by vaccine-related side effects and suffocation.
Great point.
If there's really not, if you have a Venn diagram, the two circles are pretty far apart, I would think. So I just don't, I think that the vaccine defense or the vaccine explanation is pretty desperate unless they have some sort of a credible expert witness to opine about that.
Yeah, you would think that they don't have many vaccine-related deaths that are misinterpreted as strangulation or vice versa, right? I imagine there aren't many doctors taking a look at a child that's been suffocated to death and then blaming it on Tdap or something like that. You're right. There probably is a pretty clear distinction as to what would have caused these children's death. It sounds like much of this is going to come down to a war of experts, as it is in many of these cases. Last question on this, though. They're pretty bold to have not only gone on and to do interviews about the vaccines, but then really kind of evaluated or really kind of involved themselves in this anti-vax community, even being part of a lawsuit. Do you think that will come back to haunt them?
I think it could on sentencing, obviously. If they're found guilty, and I would assume in most states the judge does the sentencing, it could inform his decision on what he should do because of a total lack of taking any responsibility for these deaths and trying to take advantage of this kind of vaccine hysteria going on as some sort of bogus defense. On the other hand, if there is some scientific basis to it, you got to listen to it and evaluate it.
Yeah. We'll see. It's going to be an interesting case once it gets in front of jurors. Like I said, probably going to be one of those battle of the experts. We'll leave it there for now. Our next case out of Chester Township, New Jersey, where the husband of a woman found stabbed to death in her home has retained an attorney, though police have not announced any suspect or arrest in the case. Therapist and new mother Brooke Hanlin was stabbed to death in her home in a New Jersey suburb nearly 5 weeks ago. Responders arrived on the scene after her husband, James Connor Hanlin, called 911, reporting the woman as non-responsive before telling dispatch she had a large laceration to her chest and pleading with personnel to arrive as quickly as possible. While a medical examiner deemed Brooke's death a homicide via multiple sharp force injuries, cops have yet to announce a suspect or even person of interest. Amid the investigation, Hanlin has retained legal counsel, and the Morris County Prosecutor's Office has stated that he is, quote unquote, communicating with investigators. All right. Sam, you're a defense attorney. Tell us here, are we viewing this all the wrong way by the idea that this guy has hired an attorney? Are we reading too much into that? Is it suspicious or is it kind of expected?
For me, it's expected. For some people, it might be suspicious. But anybody who is in the position of the husband, being the only person at the home when the body is discovered and there are stab wounds, yes, you should be consulting an attorney at the very least. Now, we don't know the underlying facts that might point to somebody else. Maybe there are some, maybe there are none. In any case, that husband needs a lawyer.
I agree with you. And I mean, let's allow ourselves to speculate a little bit here. I mean, all signs kind of point toward the husband, right? I mean, he's the person who discovers her. He usually, I would say, even without him having discovered her, usually it's the spouse that becomes suspect number one. But then you've got a very violent death in a quiet kind of suburban community with no signs of anything else. In other words, he's not saying during the 911 call, "Oh my God, my window was broken," or "Oh my God, the door was forced in." He's just saying, "I find my wife dead on the ground with stab wounds." It kind of doesn't take, the most skilled of armchair detective to say probably the husband is involved, no?
I'd say he's number one based on what we know. Now, what we don't know, I'll put on my defense attorney hat. We don't know if he just walked in from somewhere and he found her and he called 911 and was in shock, so he didn't have any time to look around to see if there was any other evidence of a break-in or an intruder or an angry nanny who had left or anything like that. So, there are other possibilities, but he is probably suspect number one.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell us why are police kind of cute sometimes about things like suspects, persons of interest? They always seem to be very guarded when they start using those terms. Do those terms matter at all? Is it just a way of kind of keeping their powder dry to say that, no one's a suspect, everyone's a suspect? Why do they do that?
I think they do it for a lot of reasons. One is the media doesn't want to get it wrong if they say somebody is the killer, because they can open themselves up to all sorts of lawsuits. I think you see this in documentaries and movies all the time where it says inspired by true events.
Right.
You kind of water it down a bit to protect yourself from some civil liability, I think. And, if they haven't truly closed the case, they do want to tell somebody they're the person of interest in the event that person's going to come forward and make a statement and possibly confess.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll see. We're keeping a close eye on this one. I gotta say, my money is on any moment now. We will hear about an arrest and it will probably be the husband. And if I'm wrong, and this man suffered the tragedy of finding his wife stabbed to death, and on top of that, there's jokers online saying that he's probably involved and I'm one of them, then I fully apologize. But I would just be shocked if it wasn't him that ends up being held responsible for this. All right, let's move to our last case out of Duxbury, Massachusetts. A mother accused of strangling her 3 children before attempting to take her own life is set to face trial next week after the final status conference hearing in this case this week. Attorneys for Lindseay Clancy have announced that they will be pursuing an insanity defense as the mother faces murder charges for the deaths of 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and infant Callan, who was just 8 months old when he died. Clancy's defense asserts that the woman was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis at the time of the 2023 deaths, claiming the woman was not in her right mind when the killings happened. Despite this, the judge denied a defense request to allow witness testimony from other mothers who have experienced the condition, allowing only expert testimony in the witnesses list, which reportedly already clocks in at 200 potential witnesses. On that list is Clancy's husband, Patrick, who will be testifying in her defense. Since the deaths, the father has been very vocal about forgiving his wife and urging the public to do the same. Prosecutors have not been as understanding, maintaining that Clancy acted with cold calculus in planning of her children's slayings, mapping out the exact amount of time her husband would be out of the house during the killings. The trial is slated to begin next week in Duxbury, despite defense motions for a change of venue, and jurors are expected to visit the Clancy home at some point during the trial to view the crime scene. Sam, first thing on this I wanted to get into, they wanted to, and I'm curious to think if you think the judge made the right call, but the defense wanted to put other women who had suffered from postpartum psychosis on the stand as kind of, I imagine, a way of explaining to jurors what this can be like from women who've actually experienced it, rather than hearing from experts talk about it. They actually want people who've been through it to talk about it. Judge says no. What do you think about that?
I think it's probably the right call. A judge has to struggle with the relevancy of other people's experiences being testified to firsthand versus funneling that through experts. Now, one thing, as you know, experts can testify based on hearsay. And when the experts testify, they can probably give case studies and examples of how somebody could suffer from this postpartum condition and give some examples. So I think the judge was just trying to limit the emotionality and possible irrelevancy or unfair prejudice to the state if actual individuals were emotionally recounting their mental state when they were going through postpartum depression. They can still get some of the information in, and maybe even a lot of the examples through the experts.
Let's break down a little bit that postpartum psychosis, because what the law requires when it comes to insanity is very different than what most people might think of as a person who might be mentally distressed. I mean, they even call this psychosis, mentally ill. The law is pretty specific, and the definition is fairly narrow. It says that a person has to not only be suffering from some sort of diagnosed condition, but that caused them to be unable to appreciate the difference between right and wrong, essentially, in its most basic terms. How do you think that'll play out in this case? I mean, when you take a look at this, you have a mother, the father is standing by her, mother, no history of any kind of criminal violence, murders her 3 beautiful young children. Anybody, I think, at first blush would take a look at that and go, well, she must have been crazy. She must have lost her mind. But is that really the question in front of jurors when it comes to insanity?
Good point. I think as I've looked briefly at Massachusetts law versus some of the standard insanity criminal defenses, I understand Massachusetts is a little bit more lenient toward defendants in that they require substantial capacity. Somebody's lost a substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of their action. So there may be a little opening there in Massachusetts. The door may be slightly more open, is what I'm saying, than in most jurisdictions, including where I practice in Texas. But yeah, I think what you have to evaluate is not just if somebody had a severe mental condition, but did it affect them in such a way as to where they lost all sense of right and wrong and whether or not their actions were violating the law. And it is not uncommon in today's world that some people are found guilty by reason of insanity, either by agreement of the state and the defense or after a hearing by a judge or a jury.
Let's turn now to the prosecution and what they will have to prove when it comes to this, because we talked about how, at least in my view, I think jurors, when first hearing about this, probably are going to lean in favor of the idea that she was not well, okay? But the prosecution is going to point to some things about the planning involved. We know that they have evidence, allegedly, that she sort of lured her husband outside of the home, sent him on an errand. She knew how long that errand would take. She knew how much time she had in the home. She strangled these children to death, as awful as it is to even think about, with exercise bands. The medical examiner is going to testify to that is not a quick death. That is a death that takes several minutes per child. So we're talking about somebody who's following through on several different steps. And the prosecution, I imagine, is going to hammer home all through of that. She's thinking about it. She's deliberating about it. She knows what she's doing. She's doing something horrible and wrong, and she continues to do it. Is that essentially the argument that prosecutors will have to make? And how successful do you think that might be?
That type of approach by the prosecution is very common in countering an insanity defense. If you have a crime that's committed impulsively with the firing of a gun or the slashing of the throat or something quick, that's a harder rebuttal to make. But in this case, it sounds like they have a substantial lead up to the actual crime, number of minutes, if not an hour. And I think that's the best counter argument to say that she did have the capacity to appreciate what she was doing was wrong and she was violating the law because of the amount of time and planning that went into it. Most critically, probably, that her sent her husband on an errand to so she could have the time alone to commit the crime.
Yeah, really awful case. Really, I mean, the other thing we didn't add into all of this is that she then allegedly attempted to take her own life, jumped out of the window. She's now permanently paralyzed from that. So it's just a complete, awful, nightmarish tragedy all around. Mm-hmm. When it comes down to selecting a jury, I imagine it's going to be a very delicate affair. What do you think each side is going to be looking for out of a potential juror when it comes to a case like this?
Well, you're always trying to eliminate jurors who have some sort of an experience that causes them not to see the evidence without prejudgment. Yeah. So if you have jurors that have had postpartum or had loved ones who had postpartum, you're going to want to really quiz them about, does that experience cause you to not look at this evidence in a neutral light? On the other hand, you may have law enforcement or other jurors with a background in law who may be real cynical or of the insanity defense or may not agree with it. So you want to explore those jurors as well from the prosecution and defense standpoint to see if they should be excluded. So the bottom line, jury selection is a process of winnowing out people who can't come into the jury trial with a so-called blank slate. And sometimes we do an effective job of that and sometimes not as effective.
Yeah. And sometimes it's not effective and we don't realize it till the whole thing's over.
Right. Absolutely.
All right. Well, we will find out soon enough how all of that goes in that case, because it's, like I said, slated to begin early next week. In the meantime, that is our show. Sam, thank you so much for coming on this week. Where can people find out more about you? Do you have a website, social media? Please tell us.
Yes, the website for my law firm is the best place. It's M as in Mary, BFC.com. MBFC.com.
Fantastic. We will look you up, my friend. I'm your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Joshua Ritter ESQ. And if you want to hear my thoughts and coverage on even more true crime cases, please check out my YouTube channel, Courtroom Confidential. And you can, of course, find all of our Sidebar episodes wherever you get your podcasts, and we would love to hear from you. If you've got questions or comments you'd like us to address, please tweet us your questions with the hashtag TCN Sidebar. And thank you for joining us at the True Crime News Sidebar.